I'd like to talk about pi. I've mentioned it on other videos and I'd like to kind of bring it out as so that when I talk about pi, you understand that it's like a double meaning, and it's supposed to have a double meaning. Pie is like a pastry thing with filling and that you can eat, or pi is a mathematical ratio from ratio to circumference of a circle. Now, the mathematical version of pi is for those who, use intelligence, wisdom, experience, knowledge, whatever, and those who see the pie as a pie food, go with the desires to eat it and consume it and to just get fat from it, say. And so what I believe in society, because wisdom doesn't sell well, doesn't spread well, doesn't preserve itself through the ages, it's much better to give people something that they can get their teeth into. A nursery rhyme, a riddle, a song, a silly tale that people don't forget, because it's absurd. And so I think there's wisdom being preserved in these tales in such a way that they all mesh together in a doctrine that goes right across the language. So, for example, the English language, with its ambiguity in words, the way it's read and said and spelled, that if you read a poem out loud and then wrote it differently, you would get a different meaning. So, you've got this hearsay aspect to the poetry. When we read it on a piece of paper, we take it as read and we can see what the word is meaning. But as we sound that word, there's that ambiguity. So there's that level of encryption that can be put in. Amongst others, mathematical encryptions. Because essentially a word doesn't need to mean what it means. If you can take a full book and tell the reader that every time we read the word frog, it means dog. So the reader then establishes that new rule, and if that new rule's then hidden somewhere so that anybody with a little bit of good heart and wisdom can see that, then they're at an advantage when reading that piece, that piece of text, that poem or story. It'd be like, in a way, like encrypting a password, a code, that your password was some kind of riddle that you had to answer, And if you were stupid, you would just say frog, but if you was clever enough, you'd say dog, and then you would enter the password. So this level of encryption can be used for all kinds of things, for good, evil, whatever. But I think in the old fairy tales, there seems to be a lot of interesting correlations between fairy tales, where they come from, little poems and that. And a lot of things seem to have very biblical connections, even though we don't notice it at first sight because there's no use of biblical words that we know. But a lot of these characters and ideals and ideas are carried like heraldry through these stories and that. So one I wanted to present in connection with pi, Little Jack Horner. Maybe you know it. Little Jack Horner sat in the corner eating his Christmas pie. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, "What a good boy am I." Now, I thought about this myself. I look online, I look on different sources to see how other people have translated it. But usually I try to go at it with a fresh thing. Before I look at it, I try and make a quick image of what it could be. And so I look at the language, pi, Are we talking about 3.1415 or whatever the pi ratio mathematically? Or are we talking about a Christmas pie? So then we look into a Christmas pie, and a Christmas pie has 13 ingredients to represent Christ and the 12 disciples. Now, if we understand those principles of Christ and the 12 disciples, we could say that it's a perfect ratio within itself. In music, we have the 12 notes, and the 13th note is the octave. And obviously there's many octaves, and in each octave there's those 12 notes. So harmony is created through 12 notes. If we had 14 or 10 notes or whatever, it would create a disharmony. So pi creates harmony. The calculation to calculate pi, this golden ratio, we build great buildings with these ratios and wheels and things and machines. The machine is built with this pi. And so we've got little Jack Horner, Jack, James, Jacob, the trickster. The Jacob's a character in the Bible, a patriarch of Jesus. So Jack is kind of like, you can't necessarily, he could be a trickster. Jack is a character that's a trickster. So you have to think for yourself when Jack's there. You can't just trust Jack at face value. You have to listen to Jack and think, well, he may be saying something cunning. So the patriarch Jacob, represents this idea of trickery, because we shouldn't take anything at face value. We shouldn't have that amount of faith that we abandon our own reason. So, this aspect of the trickster should keep us awake all the time. So Jack and the horner. Horn is a kind of, in a way, it's a little bit connected to animals and like, blowing the horn to the animals, the horns of the animal. It's like a communication. And when I say animal, I mean really sort of like a basic communication with children as well. Children would hear a whistle or a horn before they even know language. So that the horn represents kind of a very basic communication, but a very commanding one. So little Jack Horner. You might think I'm reading too deeply into it, but this is what I do. Sat in a corner, maybe the corner is a right angle. It's a perfect corner. Put in his thumb, we've got this rule of thumb somehow. We use it on Facebook and YouTube and that, the thumbs up, the thumbs down, and it's like the rule of a thumb. There's the laws of like electricity, where when the DC current is travelling in the direction of my thumb down a wire, it will create this magnetic field around it. So we have these rules of thumb, and there's a lot of things about the thumb there. So, and the word plum, obviously it means a plum that would hang from a tree. It comes also from the Germanic pflaume, plum. But if you take it to a French derivative, plum is also an English word for a string, like a vertical perfection. When something is plumb, it is perfect with gravity. And so gravity again is a big G, a big powerful force that rules our lives. It's like the biggest force of nature, the biggest law, that you cannot get around is the big G, the big gravity force. So this plum, it's like everything's going to be plumb with all the trees here and everything. Everything works with this plumb. So, and it's perfect, isn't it? It's pulled, and the pi is the circumference of that perfection. And the vertical perfection is in then the plum that's pulled out of the part of the pie and says, what am I, a good boy am I, I don't know, but it seems to me that it's, then we look at the letter P and how that's used in the word person and things, and you'll see on like legal documents like a passport type person, P. So there's this connectivity with P. Yeah. I just don't know whether to go into more detail at this point. So we've got this idea of a pie. And normally when we hear this story, little Jack Horner sat in a corner eating a Christmas pie, put in a thumb and pulled out a plum and said, what a good boy am I. If you're like anything like me, you imagine a little fat kid in the corner, and he's got red cheeks and he's like gets his plum, and just like as said, really. Why would there be any need for anything else? But at the same time, I don't really believe that things that become urban myths and legends and poems and just folklore, I think folklore is generally controlled by he who controls the printing press. When you think about it, the Crown Corporation, the Crown at some point, and I can't remember the year, it doesn't matter, when the printing press came in, they started printing the Bible with 24 letters. And, Then you got in printing, the word pi is actually a big pile of like mixed up letters, the characters that go in the printing mould, that's called a pi. Pi is also considered to be pen and ink lettering, So the word pi is very, very often used in different ways. We have the poem, "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king?" And most people I talk to about this are more happy with the idea that there were birds baked in a pie than to actually think whether it's just a riddle. It's like we don't think that people would lie. We'd rather think that people would bake 24 blackbirds in a pie than to think that maybe it's like those blackbirds are metaphors. In fact, all of the words baked is like, in the sunlight, it's about the clock and everything else. But without going into detail on that, you can see how people have jumped to the absurd version, the superstitious version. Oh no, it was really about a pie for the king. They made it and they baked pies. They baked birds in it. It's even in the history. Look, it's even written. Your version's not written. That one is. They baked birds in pies. No, they didn't. It's not even a rumour. It's something that's been put in there in folklore for us to see and either become stupid from or learn from. But the idea of these pious tales is, in a way, it's like the wise people thought, well, if people get our wisdom wrong, then we need to make sure it doesn't backfire on them. So that this wisdom works for kind of is an advantage to like less intelligent people and more intelligent people. But in two different ways. One will eat the pie and learn years later, and the other will see the pie and apply the maths. If you get my idea. The thing with the Sing a Song of Sixpence or whatever, when it's translated into the English version, it was like 4 and 20 naughty boys baked in a pie. So you'd have to really start getting stupid to think that that's really an urban legend or what really happened, that they really did used to bake 24 naughty boys in pies, So it's almost, the wise people have made it even more and more stupid to make sure that you don't get it right in the wrong way. You know what I'm saying? And this is the thing about piety at large. I used to hate church, I used to hate religion, I'll admit it, I didn't hate people in church, I just thought that they'd been suckered into, joining a bad club. Now, in a way, I mean, whichever club you're in these days, it's just madness. So I'm not going to point fingers at anyone or the other person for having a better technique of getting through life, But at the same time, I did really see the church as being some kind of very, very strange stories that didn't make sense to me. But at the same time, if we relate them to those pious tales of those things, that even if you're getting it wrong now, it'll turn around at some point to your advantage. And that's why the church says that piety is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to just take the scripture as read. That's what they say. I kind of disagree. I think we should always be there with reason. I don't think we should read anything without putting our own reason there. But that's just my opinion, and people do what they like. So the church, in a way, it's like kind of this way of teaching something or bringing, passing on some kind of wisdom that is impossible to pass on. And so that those who misunderstand it are going to get a safe-ish version of reality. I could bring loads of examples, but I don't want to, mess too much with those examples. I bring up examples on a lot of videos. For example, the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden. People think that God said to Adam and Eve, "Don't eat from the tree of knowledge," but it wasn't true. He only said to Adam, "Don't do that." So to me, when I meet a Christian and he doesn't know that, or she doesn't know that fact, then I know that they've got a little bit of reading to do, a little bit more thinking about that, because once they understand that, once they understand the difference between, say, the character in the story, the character Adam, how, listen, listening to God on his own, and then Eve found out later or something. But it's very apparent that it wasn't like a God and Adam and Eve stood all together, like it's always depicted, you see. So if you actually read the Bible, you only really actually need to read the first page or two and take note of the chronology, and you'll notice, Eve wasn't even created when that commandment was given to Adam. And so you might think, well, what relevance has that? It's got a massive relevance, and you'd work it out eventually. But to carry around the false information, it could set you back years because of just getting that little piece of information wrong. You know, the idea that Noah's Ark was full of like 2x2 animals and it was built to that size. You know, it's made to be an absurd size so that you realise it can't really be about that. It's an indication to something else that you need to interpret. You know, it's a pie. You can either eat it as it is or work it out. But if you eat it as it is, you're going to get quite a silly kind of story, you know. So you'd say, well, how can I read these stories if they're so silly? You know, to me, the Bible, you know, and it is a special book to a lot of people, and I suppose it is an old book, and I suppose it is very prevalent in society, so it is a special book. But in a way, if you can read it like any other book, like when you read, and I mean this is it's no comparison, but if you read, say, Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings, or Gone with the Wind, you read it literally. You don't read it figuratively or metaphorically or allegorically. You read it literally, but you suspend disbelief. You read The Hobbit, or you read Harry Potter, and you say, okay, they can fly, there's magic possible, but you read it literally. You don't try and convert the story to match something till you've finished even. You read the story, take it for what it is, literally. And it's the same with the Bible. I read it literally, but I don't take it literally. You know, it's like I read Harry Potter literally, but I don't take Harry Potter literally. You know, if you get do you see what I'm saying? So if we read the Bible like a really good library of stories, you know, different storybooks, because that's what Bible means, a collection of books or library, bibliothèque, you know, if we take it as a really good stories, then the stories are there with us, and then we can start to reason with them. But trying to find already some kind of metaphor and then work with that, it's just sidetracking it. And that's why most people struggle with the Bible, because they just don't simply forget everything that anyone else told them and just read it themselves. You know, you wouldn't pick up a Harry Potter and think, right, well, everyone's told me about Voldemort and this doesn't match. You'd forget what everyone told you about the story, and you would read it for you like a really good read. And if anyone's read the Silmarillion, it's really difficult to understand and read. You know, there's so many names in there. You have to kind of think to yourself, okay, the names mean something different. I'm not supposed to connect with those characters. I'm supposed to like understand that they're different archetypes of character that I need to note. Same as in the Bible, the characters are not really important to learn from, but their actions in a bigger scope of story give you, the reader, a feeling, and that feeling activates something in you that says that's right or that's wrong. You know, the Bible itself, when people say, oh, it's a spiritual book, I don't know. I just read it like a good book, literally. And if you was to take it as any kind of law book, you would notice that the point where Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, which is like page 1 or 2 or something, everything after that is like a world of sin. You see what I'm saying? So we're talking about how to get out of sin, not how to get into being really moral. You know, when we're reading books like that, it's more kind of a horror story about what goes wrong when you don't come back to yourself. You know. So the pies are there. You know, the wise people put, you know, they baked pies just in case people took the things wrong. You know. And so all this superstition that you see and all of this nonsense, when you turn around and you say, oh, you know, the Bible's just full of nonsense, it's probably because you just didn't because you've just listened to what other people said about it, That's all. I mean, all books are kind of nonsense if you don't read them, if you don't get what you need out of them. And let's face it, if the stories that they're putting on TV and in the general public, the stories that priests and politicians are portraying about the Bible are misleading stories, to a great degree. This idea that Adam and Eve stood there together and listened to God, sort of thing. This is kind of what confuses us the most. Little things like that could completely upset the concept of the story, if you like. So if you just read the first 2 pages of the Bible, you might need to read it a few times. The language is a bit old. Maybe look at the words if you don't understand them. Don't think you understand them, sort of thing. Just have a look and just try the first page, and you'll notice that a lot of what the religions have been portraying, whether they've done it on purpose or whether we would just picked up the wrong message, but that message from the Bible, what we'd been told all these years, it definitely a misleading one, and it'd only take the first 2 pages to clarify that. The most popular teachings about the Bible were incorrect. But I ain't really interested in politics and church. I'm interested in you and I. And that's where the law is. So the debate about whether we need the Bible and all those things, well, the system needs the Bible, I don't. And if it follows the Bible, then I'll check out what it's following. In times where it's not behaving, I'll have a look at its book and find out what its limitations are and what's been provided for someone like me who's floating around it. What am I supposed to think of this satanic thing that's grown out of proportion? But obviously, again, is Satan just a pie? Is he just another pie? Are we just believing in fairy stories? And that's why we're all in fear and we're scared of authority and we're shouting against it, when in actual fact, if we just got down to the nitty-gritty and looked at what we want and what is right, not trying to stop what's wrong necessarily, but trying to put what's right, then instantly what's wrong would then just fall away. All of the superstitions and everything would just fall away with when it reveals itself. The Bible itself says revelation. It's not reveling. It's revealing. It reveals. It's nothing much. It's not apocalypse, revelation. It's just that everyone's going to know. It's like everybody's going to be caught with the trousers down, sort of thing. All of those bureaucrats, all of those people who thought they had power, will suddenly see that power as just a big pie, sort of thing. We'll see that power as an illusion, but we know how to control that illusion. Humans are beings of illusion. We dwell in imaginary worlds. We make this world better for our minds and our senses. So it's not like coming back to some kind of truth of living in the jungle. It's about taking control over our reality and building the dream that we choose to build. Because we know it's a dream, but we want to at least be in control of the dream. I know when I'm jigging about and having fun, it's just me having fun. It's not going to produce anything in particular. But it maybe means a lot to me to have fun. It means a lot to you to have fun, So sometimes that reason and that clarity and that logic and that can lead, for me, to great fun. I dance around. I dance around authority. I sing. If you learn about law, if you're singing, you can say what you like, and it's not the same context. Things like that. It's ever so simple. It's ever so simple. We've just been intimidated into the corner. We've just been over-regulated and overwhelmed by corporate powerful media and the idols that can almost do miracles compared to us. We feel so inferior, so small in a world so massive. When I look at people milling around in foreign countries in China, I think to myself, I'm one little person and there's millions of those people. What am I going to change? But millions of people are only millions of individual minds, It's how we work together that makes the magic happen. Alright then. Okay, I think I'll end it there. Just think about pies, you know, think about pie. Write it on a piece of paper, have a look in the mirror, you'll notice it says 3.14 in the mirror. You know, there's something trying to be expressed, some secret trying to be communicated, and it leads to intellectual thinking. You know, it leads to reasoning, it leads to you thinking for yourself. You know, everything's kind of asking you to just think for yourself, and that's not like massive thought, but just be with yourself, you know what I'm saying? Because it's up to you to decide whether to eat the pie or calculate the pie. It's plum. Plum. Cheerio.